Hey, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are watching this from. Excited to have you back on the Live with Dan Friday here. We have a very special guest coming up. But first, I just want to say that Question Pro has X Day coming up, and that is our annual conference. It's October 26th, so make sure you join us there. It's here in Austin. If you message me, I can give you a special code that gives you a pretty hefty discount on the registration price. So feel free to hit me up if you have a desire to come. It's going to be great. We have speakers, workshops, and SMR will be there as well. So a lot of cool things that are happening there. So that's October 26th. Make sure you message me and I will give you a special code to use when you're registering. Okay, so today on the show, I have Joe Wheeler, who I've known for a long time. He just came out with a book called The Digital First Customer Experience. So we're going to be having him on talking about the book and what it's all about and everything related to that. So I'm excited to have Joe Wheeler on. I'll bring him in now. Hey, Joe, welcome to the show.
Hey, Dan, great to be here.
Awesome, awesome. And I'll say before we get started, if you have any questions for Joe as we're going through, feel free to put them in the comments section or the chat, wherever you're watching this on, if it's Facebook, LinkedIn, or YouTube. Just put them in the chat, we'll get them, and Joe's happy to answer these live. So, all right, Joe. So with that, one thing I was dying to know is, why did you decide to write this book?
Yeah, good question. Well, a couple of reasons, Dan. One was, like all of us, when we went through COVID, we noticed brands that had their digital act together, ones that didn't. So, there's an old saying, a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. So I got curious about companies that had figured this out and what made them different. And a colleague of mine at the Kellogg School, one of the smartest guys in the world in digital transformation, said, it should be an aspiration of every company to deliver a touchless experience. And, that was good advice given what we all went through. At the same time, you've heard me talk, right, Dan? I always open with that Charlotte Beers quote, which I actually sent her a note because I've never met her, to say, I think I have the record for the person who cited in the world. Maybe we could talk. Anyway, she said, the truth is what makes a brand powerful is the emotional involvement of customers. So the book is about, how do you reconcile this? Had digital first strategies advanced enough that, what we would typically expect frontline staff to deliver in terms of emotionally engaging experiences, achieved a level of advocacy. So the book is an exploration of that and looking at companies that do a great job of it, honestly.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I like that quote because it obviously brings out, emotion, and they have that connection. Can you do that with, a digital first mindset? I know you talk about it in the book around what digital first means. So maybe touch on that. And then how does that, does emotions have a factor there? Like, can you create that same emotion? I'm kind of interested to know your thoughts on that.
Well, that's one of my big insights, Dan. So we studied companies like obviously Nike and Spotify and which, is fundamentally a digital company, right? Lemonade, the insurance disruptor. And what's interesting is when you look at these companies, like Lemonade's NPS scores would rival Apple's. And when you kind of quickly content code just directly their testimonials, the word that pops the most is love. The last time I checked, that was a pretty strong emotion.
Yeah,
so
it's true.
It is interesting to me. I think companies that are really figuring this out are leveraging digital technology and humans in a way that creates an outcome at key touch points that matter to customers. Like, that hasn't changed in the world. But the big thing that's changed is, how do you scale it? How do you become kind of a bigger company and create somewhat of a flywheel that also creates great emotional outcomes? That's the tricky part. And that's what I think I learned from studying these companies.
Yeah, that's interesting. And when you say flywheel, I know in the book you talk about, personalization flywheel. Can you kind of dive a little bit more into that and let the viewers know what that is, how they should be thinking about it?
Yeah, well, what you and your team at Question Pro know is that personalization is changing a lot, right, Dan? It's not,
Yeah.
you and I are tired of being trailed by bots. You bought a handbag and suddenly every time you log in, it's trying to sell you like what matters to customers is relevance. Like, I love a recommendation that's really relevant to me. And that's why like Spotify is such a great example of their personalization strategy. Here's what we find is, when you get personalization right and the customer really gets, it's this transition of what they describe as from the attention economy to the value economy,
Mm-hmm.
then I'm like a much more receptive to that. And that creates a flywheel of
Yeah.
retention and advocacy, more products and services. And a couple of the examples from Lemonade, they actually describe how machine learning sort of drives this flywheel of customer growth for their target segments. And similarly with Spotify. So it goes from, their freemium capability, you can sign up for free. And then they add some advertising. So that improves their average revenue per user. That converts me to premium. See what I mean? You start to see consumer behavior because they're really engaged becoming much bigger over time.
Yeah, that's interesting. And your Spotify examples, actually, my daughter yesterday, she said, Dad, I'm in the top 13% of Taylor Swift listeners. And I'm like, oh, that's amazing. Like, and she wanted to take a screenshot of it and everything, right? So that personalization was something that really meant a lot to her. And I see that on Spotify. They do a really good job of integrating that in subtly to where it doesn't feel like obsessive almost. It feels like, oh, this is great. And it obviously makes you want to listen more, right? So they're really good at that, aren't they?
Well, and a big insight to your question, Dan, is it's easy to look at companies like Spotify and Lemonade and ones that are doing this well and just see the UX, just see the powerful, like look at Spotify, same front end, but I could listen to your podcast or your live with Dan recorded. I could read my book and I could listen to Taylor Swift in the same playlist.
Yeah.
Same front end, different back end. Guess what? Taylor Swift gets paid differently than Joe Wheeler would get paid for his audiobook. And I'll listen to podcasts, right, Dan, differently because I want the latest episode. But with a book, you probably want to read the chapter first. That's remarkable. Different back end operationally. So here's my point. When you think of digital first, the back end is the front end. Like the back end, the robustness of the machine learning platform is the front end, because when you get that wrong, the front end suffers, and we've seen examples of companies that's happened to.
Got it. That makes sense. That makes sense. So in your book, you talk a lot about machine learning, obviously, right? We hear a lot about that. What you talk about, will it eat the world? Is that something that you think will happen, or what's your take there?
Dan, can you repeat that? I just had a little blip there.
Yeah, sorry. I think we have. So in your book, you talk about, machine learning, obviously, right? And you kind of say, will it eat the world? It's a pretty common question. Maybe it's, it's a big question too, obviously. So, what are your thoughts on that? And you kind of maybe tie that into the Lemonade example that you mentioned, in the book, or any other relevant examples that you have.
Well, yes. And so, I'm doing this series, as you know, on LinkedIn, this 9-week series. This is one of these journeys that is a good idea when you think of it. And then like by week 4, you're like, oh, people really, are these questions really that compelling?
What am I doing? Yeah.
It's like driving to Vancouver for the first time. By the time you hit Sault Ste. Marie, you're like, should we go back?
Yeah, right.
Here's the thing. It is controversial, but what the point I make is when we looked at this, it's not just machine learning. It's the combination. When you take machine learning and artificial intelligence, and of course, ChatGPT and this next generation of artificial intelligence, obviously getting a lot of press. It's the combination of that with things like edge-based computing. Okay, when we burn algorithms into hardware accelerators to generate very fast computation models, then you add that capability, Dan, with where 5G will be. 6G. People never know this fact. Here's the thing. I've checked this out with my telecom colleagues. But when 6G becomes fully operational, and that won't happen for some time, but they are testing it. AT&T is testing it in Austin right now on specific spectrum. It'll be 30 to 50 times faster than 5G.
It's crazy. I mean, that
crazy,
30 to 50
right?
times. It's not a trivial amount at all. Yeah, that's wild.
No, and I will send you, Dan, an article that, as part of our secondary research that we looked at, that explains the impact that 6G will have on things like immersive experiences. So combine 6G with where conversational AI is going, being more proactive, et cetera, with edge-based computing, application networks, beyond APIs. The next level of APIs today is like connecting networks of applications together, it punch through. You have this convergence of technology that will just change the experiences you and I will experience in 4 to 5 years, like fundamentally changing.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. And you give the book, in the book, you give the example of Lemonade, right? So they're obviously doing this as a disruptor. I know you brought it up a little bit, previously, but can you kind of dive in how they're maybe taking this and and applying it to their business model?
Well, I love this company. I just to be transparent about it, I don't have any investment in it. I don't have a financial gain with Lemonade, but
Right.
here's the thing, they changed the business model. So
Hmm.
with most insurance companies, they tend to keep when you pay your premiums, Dan, they tend to keep those claims. They drop that to the income line. Lemonade doesn't. They take a flat fee. They get 25%. And so any
Hmm.
extra dollars that you pay go to a charity that you choose. So think about
That's
that. You
cool.
might love the World Wildlife Federation. You get to choose once a year where those extra dollars will get done. I mean, think of the brand equity that creates for their target customer.
Hmm.
So, Dan, when the
Yep.
world of insurance was going after I switched and saved, Lemonade drove right past that. There's an old saying I heard from a customer once from Harley Davidson. And this guy said, when everyone turns left, we turn right.
Oh, that's interesting. I like that.
So Lemonade turned right, and they said, "No, we're going to go after younger customers that are kind of digitally native, like Gen X, millennials, etc.
Hmm.
And we're
Hmm.
going after first-time buyers of rental insurance." And that's where they began. Now that makes a
Hmm.
ton of sense because if you have a lifetime value view of the world, you want to catch Stan Fleetwood when he was 22, had just got a credit card, and was looking for an apartment in New York City.
Hmm.
Because if I could retain you for your lifetime, Dan, retention trumps every other financial measure. Cross
Yep.
sell, all
Yep.
that stuff gets dwarfed to just holding on to you for 40, 50 years. So that was their focus. And because of that, this flywheel really takes effect. So number one, they take a flat fee. So they take the controversy in the industry off the table because you're not trying
Hmm.
to like put a claim in and exaggerating in it because you're worried you'll get refused, right? Because they've got an
Right.
incentive to refuse it, right? Because they would just make
Right.
more money for shareholders. So it's to me remarkable. The last thing I'll say about them is so, Dan, if I was an insurance agent with a legacy company, I was trying to sell you insurance, I'd say, "Hey, Dan, let's meet at 4 o'clock. Let's go to Starbucks and we'll talk this through and we can make sure we get your needs met." And we'd sit down and I'd fill out 35, 40 fields, name, birth date, dependencies. And I'd say,
Hmm.
it's not going to be this nice every day this week. Why don't we hit the golf course? You said, "Great
Hmm.
idea." Off we go. So that form goes in with maybe 30 fields filled in and 25 not, 50 not.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
with Lemonade, when their chatbot named AI Maya asks you 14 questions, behind the scenes, she pulls on 1,700 data points.
Hmm.
So tell me how accurate that pricing is going to be.
Yeah, that's
So
crazy. Yeah.
she's where your apartment or where it's located, the history of storms, your pay. You know what I mean? It's like suddenly
Hmm.
you see the power of digital first in terms of, and now what they're seeing. So they use lifetime value as a critical measure. Like many of the companies that are in our research, Dan, they're LTV6 because now they have claims data, right? So for them, what
Hmm.
matters
Hmm.
is from an ideal customer standpoint, what's your likelihood to claim, right?
Yep.
Number two is what's the likelihood of holding on to you, and what's the likelihood that you might buy pet insurance if we do a good job for you. And then when you go from your apartment to a home, we'll get home insurance, and now life insurance, and now auto insurance. So
Hmm.
their LTV6, Dan, they allocate 86% of marketing spend based on what that produces.
Wow, that's amazing. I mean, that's
I've never
pretty.
heard of another company that does that. That's to
No,
me
that's
remarkable.
yeah, that's pretty remarkable. And I like the fact that with 14 questions, you said they're pulling, unknown number. Well, you said a number, but I don't remember exactly what you said. 17,000 or
1,700. 1,700
1,700.
data. Yeah.
1,700 data points, and you're probably getting a more accurate quote than you are with, although the coffee and golf does sound nice. I will admit that, but when it comes to insurance, you probably just want to get their quote, directly. So I think that makes a lot of sense. So that's good. Interesting, super interesting. That's a great example of how machine learning is really helping us out in terms of something so simple as like car insurance. Really like it. I love it. I love these examples of an industry that's been around forever. Then someone comes in and like, no, there's a better way to do it. And I think Lemonade is a great example there. So, what are Joe? What are some of the more important insights that you think readers will get from the book? I know this was, I think, one of your questions in your 9 week venture to to answer these on social media. But maybe you can touch on it here. I thought you said some interesting things when I watched it a couple days ago.
Yeah, well, as we talked about earlier, I've tried to make these case studies meaty. So when you read
Hmm.
the VMware case, which to me is a remarkable case. If you're in the enterprise software business and maybe one of the things you're trying to figure out is how to improve your user group, that VMware case is going to really give you a pretty clear roadmap about how you would do that. So for every case, I try to go beyond kind of what you would read in a web article to what I call the heart of the matter, like really what's happening. And then on the other piece, the third section of the book, Dan, is around the playbook. And what I really wanted to do was, because I've read books like this, and I always felt like I want to go all the way to Bright. For example, I'm going to really take you through the 5 steps of how you build a business case that your CFO would say, Dan, this competes with our new product capitalization request or buying back stock. Like, you need a business case that the CFO is going to get behind and say, why isn't he working in my department? So I wanted to go all the way to Bright on terms of really explaining how do you go from an ideal storyboard to release plans with your IT team that actually hit a schedule, and put in kind of real examples from that. And then the last thing I'll say that I hope people get from an insight is, the world is changing. That's not new, but there is a digital tsunami that is coming fast and furious. And the last thing is, ChatGPT and Bard, I mean, there's good controversy and good conversations that we need to have around ethics and, how this will work. However, if you're working for a company, don't confuse kind of consumer-based, those types of things for like an enterprise-based machine learning. Like at Lemonade, their whole DevOps operation is automated. Automated. It pushes like 18 new releases a day by itself. When you're domain specific and you have a great team, you will take points, like many points of operating margin off your expense line. And that's a key takeaway.
Yeah, no, that's huge, right? Like, that's what every company wants to do. I think, if you can reduce your operating expenses, chances are you're going to be doing pretty good. So I really like that a lot. Joe, one more question for you, and then we'll probably wrap it up unless we have some questions that come in. I think I love customer communities, and it's something that was near and dear to my heart when I started at Question Pro. Communities was my baby, so I was really kind of focused on that. There's a chapter in the book, and selfishly I want to ask you about this, is fostering ownership through customer communities. And can you talk a little bit about that and the impact that customer communities can have on a business? I know you mentioned VMware and their massive community that they have, but maybe we end it with what are some of those examples of fostering ownership through customer communities? And if you want to tie in the VMware example, that'd be awesome too.
Well, and you're an expert, Dan. The power of communities is extraordinary, right? Because it's like having a focus group of your customers in the next room. Like what's not to like about always being able to? Because the big thing in business, as you know, is agile. I mean, one of the big messages in the book is, maybe 15 years ago you could get away with some problematic product launches, but the market is unforgiving today if you miss it. So if you're not using agile and test and learn and rapid experimentation with customers, you're missing it. So having a customer community that is in place consistently to be able to do rapid experimentation and co-creation is just a wonderful value, obviously. The second thing I would say is from a co-creation standpoint, I actually flew to the University of Michigan to spend time with Venkat Ramaswamy, who's like, the godfather of customer co-creation. And the thing he taught me, which was really remarkable, he said, when it comes to like these ideas and community platforms, it's about growing interactions. It's like really fostering interactions between community members where the value comes. And maybe that's obvious, I don't know, but there's other things you can focus on in communities, but driving that interaction is a big deal. The reason why I picked VMware and VMUG, Dan, is they just stand head and shoulders in their industry. I mean, 150,000 members in enterprise software and growing. I mean, that's crazy. That's remarkable. But there's 3 takeaways I'd share with you and your listeners. One is, VMware doesn't own it. They actually, like, VMUG is a separate P&L. I mean, they have 2 seats on the boards, but they let the community run itself. That's different. I mean, there might be others that I don't know about, but from my understanding, they're the only one that I know about at that level that the community runs itself. They still stay very connected. The second thing that is really remarkable is how committed VMware's leadership is to this thing. In fact, their new owner for Broadcom was pretty public about the asset he saw in VMUG and how that's going to be like one of the most important things about the acquisition that will flourish even more with their ownership of VMware. And then the last thing is, so I opened with a little quote, Dan, as you'll read from one of the VMUG members, and she tells the story of her career. And she started off as a recruiter for Monster. Now, here's the thing, like, obviously ambitious, really smart, committed person to her career. She went to the first VMUG meeting because she had signed up to be the VMware expert for her company. She started to go through the training and realized, what have I done? A little bit what we were talking about. And so she said, I need help. So she went to this VMUG community and she saw a table in the back and she thought, I'll just kind of listen. She walks over and it's all these engineers. And she said, these guys, they were guys, just took me under their wing. And she said, for the next number of months, like, they helped me in my job and my career. She started V-Ladies to get more women to come to VMUG sessions in different chapters. They flew her around the world to Japan to launch V-Ladies.
Nice.
And I said to her, I said, listen, how would you have achieved? Because now she actually works at VMware, very senior manager. I said, how would you have achieved what you did if it wasn't for VMware and VMUG? Would you have had to go get a computer science degree? She goes, here's the thing. This community supports each other. Like, it is the place for career development and help. And they're kind of unique because, those products were a bit complicated. So it kind of created a need for that kind of support, Dan.
Yeah.
But every paragraph of that chapter is worth the price of admission, just to see how they have so carefully not treated it as a lead gen engine, which many user community groups are, but treated it as the asset that is, which is a source of co-creation and a source of career development.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. That's awesome. Well, I think that's a good place to wrap it up, Joe. Everyone go get the book. I got it last night, so I've been thumbing through it, but yeah, there it is. Yeah. So go get it, pick it up. I know it's packed with great information, and anytime I talk with Joe, I always learn something. So Joe, thanks so much for coming on the show today. Really appreciate it.
Hey, Dan, do you ever have guests on twice?
I'm sure. Yeah, sometimes we do.
Let's try it. Let's do it again. Let's see what people think in 4 months.
All right, sounds good. 4 months from today, you're going to be on, okay?
I had to close, Dan.
All right. Awesome. I love it. All right. Thanks, Joe. Really appreciate it.
Bye-bye.